What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and this is the absolute beginner's guide to Emacs. So if you've never been to this channel before, I'd like to first of all say welcome. This channel is basically about crafting your system configuration using free and open source tools like GNU Emacs, GNU Geeks, and more. Like basically any of the nice sort of off the beaten path tools that you might find in the GNU Linux world. So I've made about 50 videos on Emacs for this channel, but the one thing that I haven't done yet is create a video that's explicitly for those who have never used Emacs before or those who have only used it very little. So in this video, I'm going to give you exactly what you need to get started using Emacs and to understand the basic concepts and key bindings of the editor. I know this video might actually seem pretty long. I'm not sure how long it's going to be yet. Let's just see how it goes when we record it here. But I'm going to put chapter markers in the timeline below so that you can skip ahead to various topics that you're interested in learning about, and also you can return to it as a reference. And also the notes that we're looking at on the screen right now, this is actually an org mode file, and I'm going to commit this to a GitHub repository so then you can go look at it and see exactly what I'm reading to you right now whenever you go and want to study this yourself. So let's get started. So first of all, we can talk about installing Emacs because that's the first thing you'll have to do before you can actually use it. So Emacs can be installed on GNU Linux, macOS, and Windows. The latest stable version of Emacs is 27.1. So it's best to try to find that version for your operating system. The things that we cover today obviously will be related to 27.1, but they also should work in the more recent stable versions like 25 and 26. Those have existed for a few years now, so you should be able to find those on your Linux distribution if you happen to have an older version. But if you can, definitely try to get Emacs 27.1 because it is the most recent release and it has lots of improvements upon those previous releases. All right, so for GNU Linux, definitely GNU Linux is the easiest OS for installing and using Emacs by far. It's available in pretty much every Linux distribution's package manager. So however you normally install packages in GNU Linux, you can use that to install Emacs. Typically, the name of the package is Emacs or something containing Emacs, so it's pretty easy to find. Just keep in mind, like I said before, that your distribution may actually have an older version of Emacs. Like I think in Ubuntu 2004, they have Emacs 26. So just keep in mind that there may be an older version, but it's not really a big deal if you don't have a newer version. There are ways to find newer versions as well. So just search for your distribution and look to see if there's a way to install that if you really care about having the latest version. One other question to be asked, I guess, about using Emacs on GNU Linux and also on macOS as well, possibly Windows. I'm not sure if it works on Windows. Is whether you want to use it in the graphical user interface mode or in the terminal mode. So you have options for both. Obviously, right now I'm using Emacs in graphical mode because I have, different font sizes and different font colors and all this stuff going on. However, you can also use it in the terminal, which can be very useful for various reasons, especially if you want to like SSH into another computer and use Emacs remotely, etc. Those kinds of things. So if you're very partial to using things in the terminal, it is absolutely possible to use Emacs in the terminal, and pretty much all the same functionality is available except for having different font face or different font families, I guess, for different text and also different font sizes. So those are the only limitations you technically should have by doing that. But for the purpose of these demonstrations, we're just going to show the graphical version of Emacs since that's probably the one most people will use. So on macOS, you can install Emacs pretty easily using Homebrew. A lot of people use Homebrew for installing packages on macOS. So there's a default recipe called Emacs, which can be installed using this command that we have here on the screen. There's also an alternative recipe called Emacs Plus, which I've heard about recently, which has some extra options that enable certain behavior that might be interesting to you. So if you want to have some more control over the Emacs build that you get installed on your machine, definitely check out the Emacs Plus package. You can also download a .app file for Emacs from the site emacsformacos.com. If you just want to download something and just copy it over to your computer easily, that's also a possibility. For Windows, you can download Emacs directly from the GNU website. This link that I have here just takes you directly to the installer download, so you can click that if you look at the show notes. Also, if you use MSys2, which I would guess is probably not so many of you, you can use Pacman in MSys2 to install Emacs, and then you can run that as a program in Windows. And also, if you use Chocolatey, which is probably more likely, you can use Choco install Emacs to install the latest version of Emacs on Windows, so that's pretty useful. Okay, so now that we've got Emacs installed, I assume that you've stopped the video and gone and installed Emacs by now. Let's talk about the basic concepts of Emacs so that you kind of understand what you're looking at whenever you start the editor, and also how to sort of find your way around. So, the user interface. So, Emacs has a toolbar and a menu bar like many conventional graphical programs, and they can be very useful at first to learn what functionality is available in Emacs. However, I don't think you're going to need them for very long. Once you actually get comfortable using Emacs and know how to find things yourself, you won't really need to use the menu bar very much. However, let's actually take a look at it and see what that looks like. So I'm going to jump over to another screen here where I have a very plain configuration of Emacs to use for demonstration purposes. Now, this is not the basic in-the-box configuration. You can see that I have a dark theme turned on, mainly because I don't want to blind you whenever I'm changing back and forth between the demo Emacs and my personal Emacs. So the only things that I've done to the basic in-the-box configuration here is that I have set the font size to be a little bit bigger, and I've changed the theme to be a dark thing. So everything else is just stock Emacs, what we're looking at right now. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, there is a menu bar up here at the top of the window. And there's also a toolbar that has some buttons. These icons look a little bit small because I'm using kind of a high DPI screen, but on a normal DPI screen, these things will be pretty much normal size like you would expect. So the menus are typical to what you would see in other programs. You have a file menu for dealing with files. You can see that there's, actions for opening files, opening directories, saving files, save as, close the file. And then also there's some window control commands here, which we'll talk about a little bit later, quit, etc. The interesting thing to note here is that many of the menu entries have the actual key binding that is associated with the action that this menu item performs. So this can be a very good way at first to get acquainted with the common key bindings that you will want to use in Emacs, because Emacs is best used as a keyboard-driven interface. You don't really want to use a mouse so much in Emacs. So learning the key bindings by looking at these different menus can be a really helpful way to get started fast learning those bindings. So the other thing to mention is that there are some of these menus that are here all the time, and then there's some that get displayed whenever you're looking at a certain type of buffer. So in this case, we're looking at a Lisp buffer, so we get this Lisp interaction mode information. But if I were to open up another file, like let's say an org mode file, you'll see that now we have this table menu, we have the org menu, we have the text menu, and those give you the mode-specific actions that you might want to use for that mode. We'll talk about modes in a minute. And as usual, whenever you go to see all the actions here, you can see the key bindings that you might want to learn for those actions. So like I said, for any type of file that you're editing that has its own functionality, it's definitely good to take a look at the menu items for that to see what the possible actions are, how they're organized, and also the key bindings that you might be able to use with those. So the toolbar itself, I find it to be not super helpful just because it has, common stuff you might want to do. I think the toolbar does change contextually based on things that you're doing, but I literally have never used it. I always turn it off. And that's the nice thing to know about both the menu bar and the toolbar. They can be disabled pretty easily. If you look at the series of videos I do called Emacs from Scratch, I go through in basically the first video how to turn this stuff off so that you have a more minimalistic view into Emacs, sort of like what you see right now in my configuration. So once you're ready to dispense with all of the extraneous UI elements, you can easily do that. So another interesting thing to note is that in the terminal version of Emacs, the menu bar actually is still there. And let's see if I can do this without breaking anything. So I'm going to try to run Emacs inside of a terminal right now. So Emacs-Q-NW. So we're running terminal mode Emacs inside of graphical Emacs. Sounds a little bit crazy, but that's what's happening right now. And then you see there is a menu bar up here, and I think the key is F10. So if I press F10, it actually shows the menu for the terminal mode of Emacs. I don't know all the key bindings to navigate through these. I think there's like Control N, Control P, things like that to move back and forth. But you do have all that same information still available to you the same way as you have in the graphical interface. So if you want to use terminal mode Emacs, then you still may have the ability to learn some things from the menu, which is pretty cool, I think. So one last thing. I'm kind of doing this video coming from the perspective of someone who might be using some other editors or IDEs. So I'm going to try to relate things to what you might be expecting from those IDEs. And one thing that you probably have seen a lot that you don't see right now on my screen or in this other demo Emacs is there's no file tree on the left-hand side of the window. And it's just something that Emacs doesn't have by default. Emacs predates that sort of UI paradigm of having a file tree on the left side. So it's something that you don't see. However, you can easily add that using community packages. And there's other ways to do file management and file browsing in Emacs that, in my opinion, are better than having that file tree always visible. So we'll talk about those in other videos. But just know that even though you don't see it right now, it's very easy to add that if it's something that you're used to having and you want to have. All right. So also, in all these sections, usually I'm adding links to the Emacs manual in case you want to get some extra context about the things that I'm talking about. So definitely check out the links to the Emacs manual whenever you see those in case you do need some more information. Okay, so a very important concept in Emacs that's different than what you might know from typical graphical interface paradigms or desktop environments is windows and frames. So the concept of a window is different in Emacs than what you know. In modern desktop environments, usually a window is a window for a program that is managed by the desktop environment and not by the program itself. So usually it's a window that has like an X button, a minimize button, etc. And usually when you run a program, it launches a window that you see. However, in Emacs, a window is not a desktop window. It's actually a pane inside of the current Emacs window that you're looking at right now. So let me actually just demonstrate that for you. I'm going to do is it a horizontal split or a vertical split? Let's see. It's a vertical split, I think. So basically, I'm splitting that one window you're looking at into two. So now I have two windows visible side by side. I can also do a horizontal split and have another split top and bottom here on this side. So these are windows in the concept of Emacs. And the interesting thing about windows is that, as you can see here, they all are showing the same buffer right now. That obviously they can show different buffers, but we're all looking at the same buffer. All of the windows have their own location scrolling inside that buffer. So it's a way that you can see the same file side by side, maybe looking at different parts of it, or looking at two different files and comparing them, whatever you want to do. So it's a very useful way to maximize the use of your screen real estate inside of Emacs, and that is windows. Now, what you think of as a window is called a frame in Emacs. So this whole screen that you see right now, this is one Emacs frame, and it's possible to create multiple frames in Emacs. So if we go to our demo Emacs here, what I'm going to do is split this so that you can actually see, and this is my personal configuration that's loaded up right now, so that you can see whenever I create the second frame. So I'm going to use the file menu here and click new frame. It's going to create a new frame. Then I'll go and open the old frame on this side. So now we have basically two what you might consider windows on the desktop environment, but these are actually two frames for Emacs. They all have their own file menus and toolbars, etc. That's how you can tell they're independent. However, they're not really independent in the sense that they share information from the same Emacs process. So as you see here, the same file is open in both. If I were to go looking for the scratch buffer or even this demo file that I've got set up for the configuration for this, these buffers are available in both of these frames. So whenever you try to switch to one of those, you're going to see it in both of the frames, which may be a little bit different to you if you're used to having an editor or IDE that sort of is focused on loading one project per desktop window. In Emacs, you're going to have the same stuff in both windows. So that might take a little bit of getting used to, and you might think that, oh, well, I've got all these files open. How am I going to deal with, like, keeping them separate? There are ways to deal with that, which we can talk about in another video, but it is kind of helpful in some ways. So for instance, if you want to have one frame open on one screen, if you have multiple monitors, you can have a frame open on another screen, and then you can share buffers between them. You can show the same buffer, different buffers. You have a lot more options in your workflow. So you're not really so limited by which frame opened which file or which buffer, etc. So this is one thing to know whenever you start to use Emacs is that you do have this a possibility to use multiple frames. So in my case, I don't really use multiple frames in the traditional sense. I'm actually using multiple frames here because Emacs is my desktop environment, but that's like way out of scope for this discussion. So let's just focus on the fact that in most cases, you'll probably use only a single frame unless you like to have multiple frames as part of your workflow. And as usual, we have some links here to more manual information. Okay. So buffers are also a very important concept to understand in Emacs. What we're looking at right now actually is a buffer. A buffer is basically just an object in Emacs that holds text and other information to be displayed by a window. Also, buffers can be used for things that aren't being displayed. They could be used for communicating with external processes or storing other information, writing out logs, etc. So it may not actually be something that gets displayed in a window, but in most cases, a buffer is going to be displayed in a window so that you can see it and interact with it. The most obvious example of a buffer is one that contains the contents of a file that you've opened so that you can edit it and then save it back to that file. But there are many other types of special buffers in Emacs that are used only for displaying temporary information or for even creating a full user interface. So for instance, the Magit package is a really excellent Git interface, the Git source control system interface for Emacs. And it does a custom buffer interface so that you can manage your code repository. Let me actually just show you an example of that. I'm going to open up the repository for my .dot files. And now this is a buffer that has some information about the Git repository for my .dot files. But if I go and move my cursor around and start pressing tab on these sections, it actually expands them. And you can see the diff of some of the files that I've been changing in my .dot files folder. And you can also press other buttons, like let's say LL to open up the history of changes in my repository. So basically, in Emacs, a buffer is not just something for editing files. It could be for creating a fully custom user interface to do some kind of task that you need to do. And many of the community packages that you'll find, or even stuff that's built into Emacs, will have these custom buffers that you will be looking at. And this is a normal buffer like anything else, and I can switch to that previous buffer that I was in, which is this presentation. So these things are all sort of on the same level playing field. Text files and user interface buffers can be switched between like anything else, basically. So this is actually one of the more confusing aspects of Emacs to beginners. It was very confusing to me at first because on the screen right now, you can't really see which buffers are actually open in Emacs. You have to actually list the buffers before you find them. So it could be a little bit jarring at first because you're like, I don't know where all my files are. I don't know what's open currently. Normally in an editor or an IDE, you would probably have like file tabs up at the top that would show you which files are open. Now you can actually get that in Emacs. There is a command you can run called, I think this is in earlier versions, but it may only be in Emacs 27. So just keep this in mind. There is the global tab line mode. And then it will actually give you tabs that you can click on. They don't look so nice as they do in other programs. However, this is something that is built into Emacs that you can use if you want that tab interface. However, I don't necessarily recommend that unless you really want it. It's better to get used to the buffer management commands and key bindings in Emacs. So for instance, Control-X-B, which we'll talk about in a little bit, will bring up a buffer list. Was that the right one? Control-X-B? Okay, yeah. Control-X-B will give you the ability to switch between buffers by completing them. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but basically there are ways in Emacs to get to all the buffers that are currently open very conveniently. So don't let it sort of discourage you if you don't really understand how buffers work at the outset whenever you start. So let's talk about a couple of important buffers that you will definitely see whenever you use Emacs. These are buffers that are, at least the first two will be open every time you use Emacs, and the last one is something that might show up when you're using it. The first one is the scratch buffer. And let me just switch back to it really quickly. So the scratch buffer is basically, I mean, the name scratch kind of gives you a hint, but it's basically like a blank page of paper that you can use for writing down notes or just anything temporary that you need to copy and paste somewhere. I often use it for copying some text or writing down something that I don't really need to save to a file, but I just need to kind of write it down for a moment so I can use it at some other point. So it's good for little notes. It's also already set up as a Emacs Lisp interaction mode so that you can write some simple Emacs Lisp code. Maybe if you're like trying out how to do something, or maybe you're trying to run a command a certain way, you can just use this as a temporary buffer for doing that. So it has some utility in that way. There's also the messages buffer, which is very useful because what it does is has a log of all the messages that have been written out for the user to see in Emacs. So there's this line down at the bottom of the screen, which we'll talk about in a moment, where messages get written. And if I were to try to scroll up in this screen right now, you'll see that there's a beginning of buffer message that gets written, basically saying I can't scroll up anymore. But the same message is being written to this message log. So if you ever see a string get written to the bottom of the screen, you can always go to this messages buffer to see the history of things that were written to the screen in case you missed it. Or maybe you just want to go back and check to see what happened. So it can be very useful for that. Definitely take a look at the messages buffer sometime just to see what kind of information is in there. And lastly, there is the warnings buffer, which is basically a buffer that shows you like potential errors that have been encountered while running Emacs. I don't know if I have one right now. Yeah, I do. So basically, I have some errors here, or warnings here, basically, that are being written from a package. And you might see this buffer pop up if there is any kind of error like that. It usually is pretty intrusive because they want you to see what's happening. So if it does pop up, don't worry, because it doesn't necessarily mean anything catastrophic is happening, but it's something to keep in mind if you do see it. So now let's talk about the mode line. This is not really something that the name is not very obvious whenever you first hear it, but it's something that will remind you of something that you're used to from other editors. So in many editors or IDEs, what you'll see is there's a status bar at the bottom of the screen, which basically gives you the current status of the editor, maybe information about the line and column where your cursor is in the currently open file, maybe what type of file it is, that sort of thing. Well, Emacs has something like that, and they call it the mode line. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen here, you can see that we are currently in the messages buffer. I can click on this actually, and it will switch the buffers. So that's another way to switch buffers, but like I said, I don't recommend using the mouse very heavily in Emacs. You also have information about like where you are in the buffer. Right now it says all because we are looking at a buffer where you can see everything at once. However, if you start scrolling in a buffer that's long, you'll see that we're like 8% ahead in the buffer. We're also currently on line 85. And then some packages will actually show you information like basically we're seeing that we're in a Git repository and we're on the master branch. That could be pretty helpful. This is something that also is pretty common in IDEs. And then you see what type of file we're in. So this is an org mode file. If you haven't used Emacs before and you haven't heard of org mode, it's basically like markdown files where you have a file with markup, but it's a lot more than that. So definitely check out my videos on org mode if you haven't heard of org mode before, because it can do many, many things. However, this is basically just saying that we are in an org mode file. You can actually click on this to get the same menus down here that you get for the mode up here in the menu bar. So if you've turned off the menu bar in the future, but you still want to see those menus for this mode, you can still click on the mode here to see those menus, which is kind of helpful. So let's see what else. Yes, so one major difference between the mode line and the status bar compared to other IDEs is that you actually get one mode line per window inside of Emacs. So like I was saying before, windows are like panes inside of Emacs, and when you split the window, you'll actually get one mode line per window that's split. So in this case, I'm going to try to do a couple splits, and we can see that this window below has its own mode line, and this one has its own mode line that only extends to the point where this window is visible. And this one also has its own mode line. And they all mention which file they have open. So I can basically switch to scratch buffer here. I can switch to the demo.el here. And you can see that we have all the mode lines have the name of the buffer visible on each of them basically, and all that same information visible at the same time. So this is kind of good for being able to get information about what windows you have open at a glance. And also there could be window specific information that can be helpful for like jumping to different windows, maybe if you have a package for that. So it's kind of useful, even though maybe it does seem like it wastes some screen space, but I find it to be pretty useful. It's a nice way to sort of delineate what's happening on the screen. So also, the last thing to mention is that the mode line is fully customizable and can be made to look very nice through your own configuration or from community packages. So all of this text here, you can change all of it. You can change the format of how the information is displayed. You can change whether it's aligned to the right or to the left. You can change the color. You can add icons. You can do basically anything you want to do with this line. As you can see here, I have a much more minimal and nice looking line that has different colors of text. It has sort of more well-presented information, has icons, and this comes from a package called Doom Mode Line. So definitely take a look at the different mode line packages that are available in the Emacs community. On one of the videos of Emacs from scratch, maybe video number 2 or 3, I think, I show how to set up this mode line. So if you want to learn how to configure this to do that, definitely check out that series. But just keep in mind that even though the initial look of Emacs is kind of like old looking and maybe not so attractive, you can change all of that and make it look really nice without a whole lot of work. All right, so the echo area and the Minibuffer, these are also very important, and I sort of pointed to that before. So the echo area is this line at the very bottom of the screen where messages get written whenever things happen in Emacs. So like if I try to scroll up in this buffer when it's already at the top, it will write out beginning of the buffer here in the echo area. So this is the place where you're going to get a lot of information from packages. Like maybe if you're using an IDE package and you put your cursor on a particular function name, it might give you the documentation for that function down in the bottom. It's just a very useful place for showing transient information that might be helpful to you at any given moment. However, that same area gets used for something else called the Minibuffer. And the Minibuffer is basically another temporary interaction space for the user where you can be prompted for information or selections or anything like that. So for instance, if I try to open a file with the find file key binding, you can see now that in the echo area, we now have a prompt for find file, and it gives me the current directory to start from. And once I start moving my cursor around, you can see that I'm actually typing in this Minibuffer at the bottom of the screen. Now, this Minibuffer actually can have multiple lines, not just that single line. So if you look at my buffer switching command, the one that I use in my configuration, this has multiple lines, and I can actually move my cursor through them to select the different buffers. So basically, this Minibuffer area actually is very useful, and a lot of your interaction with Emacs is going to happen through commands that use the Minibuffer. So very useful thing to understand. Also, it's not very hard to understand. It's just a place at the bottom of the screen where things tend to happen. So check out these two entries in the Emacs manual if you want to learn more about those. All right, so commands. Commands are a very important part of Emacs because this is where a lot of the useful functionality in Emacs comes from. So command in Emacs is basically a function that has some special information attached to it so that it gets treated as a user-facing command, something that the user might actually want to execute. So a lot of this is like editing behavior, like if you want to delete a line or insert some text or whatever, those can all be done through commands. However, a lot of other useful things can be done through commands as well, which I'll show some examples for in a second. So in Emacs, to run a command, you can either bind a command to a key binding, which is already done in a lot of cases for built-in functionality, but you can run any command by name by using the Alt-X key binding. So if I go over to the demo here, hit Alt-X, now you see in the echo area, I get a prompt for the MX, which I'll explain in a minute, to basically type in the name of a command. Now, this prompt can be completed with all the names of the commands that are in Emacs. So if I press Tab to do completion, you're going to get a listing of all possible commands in Emacs at this moment. A lot of these commands come from Emacs built in, but any commands, any third-party packages or community packages you install will also add their own commands, and you can write your own commands too, which show up in this list. So basically anything that's possible to do by the user in Emacs will show up here. And one thing you might notice is that many of these commands have prefixes with a particular concept, like mouse, drag, etc. This actually makes it very easy to do completions only for a certain subset of the commands. So if I wanted to type in mouse-drag and press tab, it will complete to all of the mouse drag commands. So this is a very nice way to look for commands that are related to a specific concept. So another one you could do is like find dash to do all the basically the file visiting commands, etc. So this is a very useful way to find things that you can do in Emacs. So basically, like I said, not all of them are for editing. There's things that you can do for showing different behavior in Emacs, or different interfaces, basically. So I want to show you a couple of these really quickly. So there's one called dired, and like I mentioned before, there are better ways to do file listings in Emacs than just having a tree open. Dired is one example of this. It's basically a directory browser inside of Emacs. So if I use Alt-X and type in dired, press enter, it's going to ask me which directory that I want to open in dired. I'm just going to leave it to be the one that I'm currently in and press enter. Now we get this buffer that basically shows us all the files and directories that are inside of that directory, and all the information, like which user owns the file, which group owns the file, the permissions, the file change date, etc. Basically, it looks like the output of ls on Linux, which is true because it actually does come from ls effectively. But you can navigate through this listing of files and press enter on any file to open it. And you can also navigate through directories. So this org files is a directory. If I press enter, it goes into that directory, and I can open any of those files in this subdirectory. So you can even press enter on the ... to go up one level as well. So it's kind of useful to be able to have this kind of browsing functionality built into Emacs. You can also do things like copying files, moving files, etc. So many of these commands will do extra things that are not just for editing files. They're going to be for useful behavior that you might want to see. So let's see, what else do I have? So calendar. So you can actually show a calendar. Run Alt-X, type calendar, and it will give you this nice calendar view at the bottom of the screen. And this is a special little buffer here that you have key bindings in. So if you see that there's this right angle bracket, you can click that, but you can also type that character on the keyboard and go back and forward in your calendar to look at different days, which is pretty awesome. There's also a built-in shell in Emacs. So if I run Alt-X and type in eshell, you see it at the bottom of the screen. Hopefully you notice that. I press enter, and now we get this embedded shell in Emacs. And the interesting thing about this shell is that it actually is written in Emacs Lisp, and it emulates Bash. So this shell works on GNU Linux, it works on macOS, and it works on Windows all the same way because it's written in Emacs Lisp. So you have basically a normal shell environment that you can use anywhere all the same way. So as you can see, through the power of commands in Emacs and also through the abilities that buffers provide, you can have all kinds of interactive experiences inside of these windows. So you just basically have to go look for all the commands that you might want to use for that. And I'll give you one last one just for the sake of amusement. If you get bored one day and you want to play a game, just type in, hit Alt-X and type in Tetris. And then we can just go ahead and play a little game of Tetris here in Emacs. I know it's probably kind of weird to think that a Tetris game comes bundled with Emacs, but you would actually be surprised how many more games are actually included with Emacs, among other things. So this is just something to keep in mind for just sort of proving to yourself that there's a lot of things that you can do with Emacs with the built-in functionality. So as I mentioned before, you can install new commands into Emacs using community packages, and you can also write your own. We'll cover both of these things in another video. So, major and minor modes, another really important concept in Emacs. So in other editors, there's usually functionality that gets enabled for files with a particular extension. So for instance, maybe you get Python programming functionality for .py files that you open. So Emacs also has this. This functionality is provided through something called a major mode. So a major mode provides the functionality needed for a particular buffer, and it's usually activated based on the extension of a file that you open in that buffer. So like I said, if you open a .py file, it would load the Python mode, etc. Sometimes this doesn't happen by default. Maybe you install a package from the community for a particular language. You may have to do a little bit of configuration before it will open for that file format, but a lot of the stuff that's built into Emacs, like .el files for Emacs Lisp, etc., will open up a specific mode. And a lot of times what these modes do for file formats is they turn on syntax highlighting so that when you open a file, you actually get colorization of all the symbols in the file, which I'm sure you're used to from other editors or IDEs. However, there can be other functionality that gets enabled for custom modes. So like we saw before with that Magit buffer that shows the git status of my directory, of my repository, that actually comes from a major mode that gets enabled whenever I run that Magit status command. So major modes are what basically provide the core functionality for a specific buffer. Now, major modes often are activated using commands. So even if it is a mode that gets activated using a file extension, it's still going to activate a mode using its command. So if we were to type in, let's say, org-mode. So for any file that ends with the .org extension, there's probably going to be some mapping in Emacs that says you need to run the org-mode command, which turns on the major mode for org files, basically. So org mode. So basically, any buffer is going to have some mode that gets loaded, some major mode that gets loaded. And if there's nothing that's specified for a particular mode, it might get, for a particular type of buffer, it might get loaded up in what's called the fundamental mode, which is basically just means there's really no special functionality added. The last important thing to mention about major modes is that there can only be one major mode active in the buffer at any given time. So if you try to start a major mode in a buffer, actually, let's go do an example of that. So I'll load up emacs.org. Let me close this really quickly. Whoops, I'm not using my normal key binding, so I'm a little bit lost sometimes in this configuration. All right, so right now we're in org mode, right? So you can see down here that this is org. I think if I hover over it, does it say org mode? No. But what if I change it to another mode? Like, let's say I run a command to change it to some other mode. So there's like a Python mode. Let's just run Python mode and see what happens. I'm gonna press enter. And what's gonna happen is all the syntax highlighting in this buffer changes. The mode down here in the mode line also changes, and that's because we changed to Python mode, even though this is not a Python file. So you can basically do whatever you want. You can start any mode at any time. It just may not have the right results. So that just goes to show that Emacs doesn't really have a specific understanding other than what's put in the configuration about what mode is possible for any file. You can activate whatever mode at any time. So I'm just going to go back to org mode here, run that command again to put it back into org mode, and now we're back to it. So that also demonstrates that there can only ever be one major mode at any given time. I was able to change the major mode, but there was only one active. So there's a different type of mode that can be active where many are active at the same time, both in the single buffer that you're looking at and globally across Emacs, and that's called a minor mode. So minor modes typically provide helpful functionality that isn't specific to the major mode of the current buffer. But they're usually things that you might need to customize your workflow or even change the way that things are displayed in Emacs. So many things that come from third-party or community packages are going to provide minor modes because they're sort of like extra functionality that are really helpful. There's plenty of minor modes that are built into Emacs, and we're about to look at one of them. All right. So there is a mode called eshell line mode, which will cause the current line that your cursor is on in the file to be highlighted. So what I'm going to do is in the mini buffer, I'm going to press Alt-X to pull up the command prompt, basically. And I'm going to type in hl-line-mode, press enter. And now you can see that we have a nasty yellow color highlighting the current line where my cursor is. And that's because I turned on the hl line mode to highlight the current line. However, if we switch to another buffer, you'll see that the current line is not actually being highlighted. Let me find a better one that demonstrates this a little bit more clearly. And now this one does not actually have the highlighting turned on. And that's because I only turned on that highlighting for the other buffer. So that means that a minor mode can be turned on only in one buffer. However, some minor modes provide a global version of the minor mode so that they get turned on in all buffers. So now if I were to run the global hl line mode by using Alt-X and press enter, it turns it on in this buffer. But then if we go to the messages buffer, you can see that it's also on there as well. So minor modes can be turned on locally or globally, and you can have many minor modes turned on at the same time, either locally or globally. So minor modes are a way to sort of add additional functionality in wherever you want it to be at any time. You can also turn them on and off conditionally for various buffers. You have a lot of flexibility in what you can do with that, which is a lot different than other editors that you might know of. Usually when you install an extension in a particular editor, it's always on or always off depending on what you set it for. So in Emacs, you have a lot more flexibility on how you deal with that. All right, so now that we've covered the basic concepts of Emacs and sort of the high-level things that you're going to want to know to use it effectively, let's talk about the key bindings that you can use to do things that you would normally want to do on a daily basis. So as I mentioned before, Emacs is definitely the most efficient and productive when you focus on keyboard-based control. The key binding system, frankly, is one of the most flexible and customizable I've ever seen. And once you start like really getting into learning how to customize your key bindings in Emacs, you're gonna realize how limited other programs are by comparison because it's just so good. So today, I'm just gonna cover some basic key bindings that you're gonna wanna learn for basic everyday use. And in future videos, I'm gonna go much more in depth about the different areas of Emacs and show you what the key bindings are to use those effectively. So that basically you can make your text editing and your general workflow a lot more efficient. But before we start talking about all those key bindings, let's first understand how key bindings are represented in Emacs. So you're often going to see people write out key bindings in a very specific format whenever they're trying to tell you what keys to press. Especially in Emacs itself, if you go look into the menu bar, you're going to see that these strings here have a very specific syntax to tell you what keys are being pressed. And I'm going to explain to you what those things mean right now. So when you see a character like capital C and a hyphen and then another character after it, that basically means you need to hold Control and then press the letter that follows. So in this case, it's Control C because we have the capital C for Control, dash, lowercase c for lowercase c. So basically hold the Control key and press the letter C, and which is what I just did. So now it basically waits for the next part of a key binding that starts with Control C. Now, you will also see key bindings where there will be a pair of things like C-X, C-S. What this means is that you hold Control, press X, and then you either release Control and then press it again and then press S, or you just keep holding Control, then you press X and then S while holding Control. I prefer the latter option. I'm sure that many Emacs users prefer that because it's way more efficient and easier on the fingers to not just like be Control X, Control S, you know, like lifting your finger every time. It's gonna really tire you out and make your fingers hurt if you do that. So when you see a sequence of keys like this where they all start with the same letter, just keep holding that letter while you press the other letters in the sequence. So hold Control, press X, then S for this key binding. Now, there's a little bit of a difference in the next one where the first one has Control attached to it for Control X, but then the second letter is by itself. It doesn't have anything else with a hyphen in front of it. What this means is hold Control, press X, then release Control, then press the letter B by itself. So there's many cases where you will see bindings that have a control character used for the first letter and then no control characters used for the second letter. So definitely keep that in mind. Those ones can be a little bit harder to hit sometimes because you have to release your pinky off the control key at the right time, but you'll get used to it. And then you have things like MX. So this is actually the Alt X binding that we've been talking about before. And if you look at this little table down here, or this little list of things here, what I'm basically telling you is that C stands for Control and M stands for Alt. But that's because Emacs predates keyboards that have the Alt key. Emacs was written for a system that has a different set of keys altogether, and one of them was called Meta. So in this case, M stands for Meta, but really in modern keyboards, this is represented by Alt. So anytime you see the capital M, think of the Alt key. Similarly, the capital S is for Shift, and the lowercase s is for the Super key, which is also one of those keys from those old keyboards. And this one actually is the Windows key on conventional keyboards these days. Or maybe if you have a Linux-specific computer, that's the Linux Penguin key. Or maybe if you have a Mac, that's going to be the Option key, I think is what it turns out to be. It could also be Command. I don't remember which one it shows up as on macOS keyboards. But usually on normal external keyboards, it would be the Windows key. Okay, so basically the Meta X is the one we were talking about before. However, you can have very funky key bindings that have a combination of modifier keys that are being used in the sequence. So in this case, we have Alt G and then Control S, and those are actually pressed in sequence. So you would hold Alt, press G, release Alt, then hold Control, press S. You don't see these quite as often because they're a little bit harder to press, but usually they're provided in places where it's an action you wouldn't do frequently, and it's just there in case you want a key binding to do that action if you have to for some reason, if you don't want to have to like go look for the command in the command list. So just keep in mind that if you see a binding that has this kind of differing modifiers, that is an actual key binding. It's just you have to do the modifiers separately. Okay, so you can also combine things, like you can have Control Alt and then a letter press at the same time. So here we have an example of CMS, which would be Control and Alt held down and press S at the same time. You can do like Alt Shift D, etc. So these modifier keys can be combined in a lot of different ways to have more key bindings that get created. But most often you'll see these sequences instead, where you have like Control X, Control S or something like that. Because in Emacs, there's sort of like a meme about how Emacs, basically you have all these crazy key bindings where you hold Control and hit like 5 letters. It is kind of like that, but that's just because once you start getting into the usage flow of Emacs, you realize that it actually is a lot more efficient using key bindings like this than it is to like go clicking around in menus. All right, so the last important thing to mention about key bindings in Emacs is that there are 2 prefixes that are very commonly seen that you should understand. Now, a prefix is basically any key sequence that has another key press after it. So when we saw this Control X, Control S, Control X in this case is actually a prefix. So if I press Control X right now, Emacs will be waiting for the next key in the sequence, because it knows that all other key bindings that start with Control X, they have some other thing that needs to come after it. So this is now considered to be a prefix. And now basically it's waiting for me to press the next key in the sequence. So if I press Control S, then it tells me no changes need to be saved, because that's actually the key binding for saving a file. So it waits as long as it needs to for you to actually press the next key. So don't worry if you have these sort of key sequences. You don't have to press them really fast. You can press them at your own speed until you get more comfortable using them. So back to the point. Control X is the prefix for all of Emacs' primary key bindings, for like opening files, saving files, changing the window configurations in Emacs, creating windows, creating frames, all that kind of stuff. If you press Control X, there's a lot of bindings that show up under that. You can actually see all of these here using the which key package, which I have installed. This is not actually something that comes by default in Emacs. If you were to go into this Emacs here, the demo Emacs, and press Control X, you can see down in the echo area, it's basically just waiting for you to press something else, and it doesn't tell you what the possibilities are. So there are definitely packages that make this a lot easier. Check out the Emacs from Scratch series. I think the first 1 or 2 videos I show how to set that up if you're interested. Also, Control C is another very common key prefix, where if you press Control C, you will get the key bindings for the current major mode that's active, and maybe some other minor modes that are active. And usually those are supposed to have control keys bound to the things that come next in the sequence, so that you don't pollute the key map. But usually this Control C is also meant for user key bindings. So usually you would be able to go in your configuration and set up key bindings under the Control C prefix for things that you want to do for your own workflow. So just keep in mind that this prefix Control C is shared between modes and the user configuration. So you may have some overlap there sometimes you'll have to watch out for. Okay. So, very important thing, how to open and save files. To open a file in Emacs, you can press Control X and then Control F for the find file command. So if I use Control X, you can see down here in the echo area, it's waiting for the next character. So then I'll press Control F, and now the Minibuffer is asking me for what file to load. So I can type in init.el. This actually will do completion if you press Tab. So if I press Tab just at the directory path, just press it twice and it will give you all the files that are available under that path. You can even complete the directory names as well. Press Tab there, it will complete that file. If I type in in, which I know there's a file that starts with that in this folder, press Tab, it will complete to init.el. Then you press Enter and it will load the file. So that's how you open a file in Emacs to be edited. Control X, Control F to run the find file command. Now, if you want to make some changes to a file and then save it, you need to know how to save the file. And the binding for that is Control X, Control S. So in this buffer, I can go and change something. So let's just say I add a little comment here, hello. I can use Control X and then Control S. And then you can see here in the echo area, it says it wrote that file out to that path. And like I mentioned before, you can go to the messages buffer if you want to, Control X, Control B, messages. And then you can see that it wrote out saving file, the file path, and then it says that it completed saving that file. So anytime you save a file, it's actually going to write that out to the messages log so that you can see that there whenever it happened. And also, a thing you might want to do in certain editors is use a save as command to save the current file to another, or the current buffer to another location. Maybe it's one file that you're editing, but you want to duplicate it to another file. You can use Control-X, Control-W for the write file command, which will allow you to save it to another buffer. So I'm here in this init.el file right now. If I use Control-X, Control-W, it will ask me what file I want to write this to. Then I can say not demo, let's see, test.el. Press enter. Now it has saved this file buffer to the file test.el, and now you can see that the buffer name has also changed along with that, because now it's going to treat this as that new file going forward as you're editing it. However, the old file still does exist, and you can get back to it if you want to. So those are the very basic file operations that you would want to know about. I'll cover that in a minute. All right, so now let's talk about switching buffers. So as I mentioned before, you can have a bunch of buffers open in Emacs at the same time, but you might not actually know which ones are there. So to switch buffers, you can use the Control-X B binding. Now, keep in mind that this is the Control-X and then the single letter B binding, and not like the holding control for each one of them before. So I'm going to use Control-X, and I'm going to release Control, and I'm going to press B. And then I pressed the wrong key at that moment. Control-X, B. Now it gives me a prompt in the mini buffer in the echo area saying switch to buffer. So you can press Tab to get a list of all the buffers that are available. And if you click on any of these, it will automatically switch to the buffer the buffer that you clicked on. But you can also press D or T, basically. Press T and then hit Tab to complete anything that has TE in it. And then press TES, press Enter. And then we are now into the test.el buffer. So that's one way to quickly search to switch to a buffer if you know the name of the buffer. But sometimes maybe you don't remember what the name of the buffer is, or you don't really remember which buffers you have open. So there is a way to list those buffers if you use Control-X, Control-B. So instead of just using the single letter B by itself, actually use Control this time. Control-X, Control-B. And that will give you this buffer list view, where you can see all the buffers that are open, you can see which file they correspond to, you can see what the major mode is, you can see the size, etc. Then you can also click on a file to open it. You can also use your your keyboard and press enter on a file to open that as well. So that's just another way to see all those buffers. And keep in mind, you can still click buffers in the menu up here and see all those buffers here as well to switch between them. Those two key bindings that I mentioned to you just now are both represented here as well, Control-X B and Control-X Control-B. So you can see those easily. Also, a couple things I did not mention in the notes here, but there's a previous buffer and next buffer if you want to just quickly switch between them. Control-X left arrow, Control-X right arrow. So if I use Control-X right arrow, I can sort of cycle through the buffers that are available. So Control-X left, Control-X left. So basically you can just get through all of them really easy. So basically if you want to go back and forth between one buffer and another, Control-X right arrow, Control-X left arrow, basically. So you're just sort of cycling through that chain of buffers, basically. I should add that to the notes here. Let me actually make a note for myself to do next prev buffer. Okay, let's see if I remember to do that. If you see this in the show notes afterward, you'll realize I failed myself. Okay, cutting and copying text. Very common thing you might want to do inside of your editor. However, this is an area that always confuses new Emacs users because the concepts here are different than what you expect. So many programs across Linux, Windows, and macOS, well, let's just say Linux and Windows because that's the ones that do this the most, use Control-C to copy text and Control-X to copy the current text and then delete it, which is a cut operation. This is not the case in Emacs. So as we mentioned before, Control-C and Control-X actually have special meaning in Emacs, so they can't be used for cut and copy. So they have a different strategy for doing this, and I think this is actually because cut and copy and paste in Emacs predates the common cut and paste metaphors in UI. So Emacs has its own idea for it because it came before all those things happened. So in Emacs, to kill text means that you're going to cut it, basically. I don't know why they use the word kill for that, but that's what it's called, so that's what we're going to use. So it basically copies the text and then deletes it. The most common thing you're going to do is to kill a region, which is basically a selection of text that you've made, either just to delete it or to cut it to be pasted somewhere else. So to kill a region, first you need to select some text to make a region to be killed. And you can make one by marking the region using control space. So in this buffer, I'm gonna hit control space, and then I'm gonna start moving my arrow keys around, and you can see how the text is being highlighted now. So that basically creates a selection or a region in Emacs terminology. I think you can also hold shift. Okay, that actually doesn't work in this mode, but just keep in mind you can use control space and then use the arrow keys to start selecting a region. There are other commands for marking text based on words or sentences, etc. We'll go into that in a different video. For now, just know that control space will start the selection wherever you want it to be. Let's see, did I actually put the binding in here for... Yeah, I didn't. Okay, so control W is what you would use once you make the selection to actually cut the text. So I'm going to use control space, and then I'm going to start making a selection here. Then I'm going to press control W, and that will delete that text, but I actually copied it at the same time so it could be inserted somewhere else. So now we have some text that has been copied to something called the kill ring, which is basically a list of things that have been copied before. And we can now paste it, which I'll show you in the next section. The last thing I want to mention to you is that this kill ring actually has some interesting functionality, and we're going to talk about it in a future episode whenever I have some time to do that. So to paste that text that we copied, you can use Control Y to yank. I don't know why yank is the terminology that's being used for paste in Emacs, but that's what it is. So if you ever see something talking about yanking text in Emacs, that's basically pasting text. So in this buffer, I'm going to move my cursor down. I'm going to press Control Y for yank, and that's going to paste back in that text that I had previously cut from this buffer. So just goes to show you that there is cut and paste, or cut and paste, but it just has different terminology in Emacs, which is a little bit confusing, and different key bindings. So once again, Control space to select text, Control W to cut it, Control Y to paste it. All right, so if you are so tied to the old cut, copy, paste key bindings that are used all the time in Emacs, in Windows and Linux, you can actually turn those on using something called CUA Mode. I don't remember what CUA actually stands for, but basically what it does is it makes it so that when you select text, it actually makes Control C, Control X actually you do cut and copy, and it makes Control V do paste the way that you expect. So the way that you can turn that on very easily is to go to the options menu in Emacs and then click this use CUA keys. And once I do that, I can go and select some text using Control space, and then use Control C to copy, and then go somewhere else and then press Control V to paste. So it does what you expect it to do. It acts exactly like you expect from a more sort of conventional desktop editor. So you could also, I think, use Shift and the arrow keys. Well, it was working for me earlier. I don't know what caused it to work, but it seemed like there was a Shift arrow keys functionality that would do shift selection, but it may be because I'm in an org mode buffer and it doesn't work that way. But just know that if you want that functionality, you can easily turn it on using the CUA keys. Now, you can also use the CUA Mode command in the command list. If you press Enter, you see me typing down here in the echo area. Press Enter here, it turns on CUA Mode in the way that you expect. So that's another way to turn on the same functionality. Okay, undo and redo. Another very important thing for editing text in a text editor. Is also another thing that's different than what you might be used to. So the undo key binding by default is Control _, but you can also use Control, whichever slash this is. I can never remember whether it's forward or backslash, but just use that slash character that is on the same key as the question mark on the US keyboard. And you can undo a change that you made. So let's try to write some text here. So I'm gonna say hello, and then another test. So now what I'm gonna do is press Control _, and it's gonna undo that edit. Press Control _ again. It's gonna undo that edit. Press Control _ again. It's gonna undo that edit. And I can keep undoing until I go back to the state of the file whenever it was saved last. So you probably wanna know how to do redo. Well, this is a little bit weird because what you actually have to do is press Control G first, which will then reset the undo state and change the undo direction. So now if I was to press Control _, it's going to redo the things that I just undid, as you can see. And then as soon as I get back to the place where I was at, if I've reversed the undo history all the way back to where it was and start pressing Control underscore again, it starts going undo again. So it goes back in the other direction again. So it's a very different model of undo, and it's kind of confusing to people. There are ways to install different undo methods in Emacs that you can use. We'll go into that in a different episode, but just try to learn this one for now and see how it goes for you before you go try to find another one. So let's see. Okay, so another thing that is actually kind of useful that you might need to know that is not very obvious at first is how to cancel an operation. So sometimes you're going to run a command that you're going to want to cancel it before it completes. Either it's going to do some long-running operation in the background, or it's going to have a prompt that comes up that you no longer want. You're going to want to get rid of that somehow. For this, you can press Control G. This is basically the quit command in the keyboard quit command in Emacs. And it interrupts any active command and brings you back to a normal state in Emacs. So let's say I use Control X, Control F to use find file. You can see we have the prompt down here in the echo area. If I press Control G, it cancels the prompt, and I go back to editing in the normal way. Also, if you run anything that seems to be taking a long time, or maybe it hangs Emacs, like if you see Emacs freeze and you can't actually click on anything or press any keys, just try to keep pressing Control G, because sometimes that will actually kick out whatever hang is happening in Emacs and make it so that you can continue your work. So don't freak out if Emacs ever hangs. Just keep spamming Control G. Just hit Control G until something happens, and then if you hit Control G like 10 times and nothing happens, then you could probably kill Emacs. But Control G can get you out of a jam in a lot of cases. So just one last thing, learning more key bindings in the editor. There's a lot of ways to do that. As we talked about before, looking at the menu bar and seeing what keys are represented there is a great way to figure out what kinds of key bindings are available, as well as what kind of operations are available. There's also the command describe bindings. So if you go into the demo here, use Alt X to get the command list, type in describe-bindings, press enter. It's going to give you a listing of all of the active bindings currently in Emacs for this buffer, basically. So globally and in the buffer. And there is a lot of key bindings here, and there's a lot of commands that are bound. So a lot of these that are like single control plus letter keys are actually movement keys or editing keys inside of the buffer. So these are very useful to look at to see like what things you could do. So like for instance, Control N. If I put my cursor here and use Control N, it takes me to the next line. If you look here, there's Control P for previous line, so you can use Control P for previous line. So that's actually a way to navigate through the file without having to move your hand to the arrow keys. So once you start looking at this list, you might learn a lot of things that might save you a lot of time whenever you're editing in Emacs. So this is a great way to learn a lot of things that you don't know about already in Emacs. There's also describe keys. So for instance, if you've heard about a particular key binding, or maybe like you pressed something by accident and you don't know what it did, you can use describe key, the describe key command, and what it will do is prompt you for a key to look up. You can give it whatever key binding you want, and then it will tell you what command is bound to that key. So let me just do that right now. I'm going to use Alt X, type in describe-key, press enter. Now I'm going to type in Control X, Control F. And then it gives me this documentation page. It says that this key is bound to find file, and we'll give you all the documentation about the find file command. So in Emacs, there's all this help information that's built in, and this is one thing you can do. You can find out what command a key is bound to, and it's very helpful. So keep that in mind in case you want to know what a particular key does. And since we've already mentioned it, let's just mention it a little bit more. The help system in Emacs is fantastic. The entire Emacs manual is built into Emacs. You can read it inside of Emacs to navigate around it. You can find out all kinds of information about Emacs there. And then there's more functions that start with the word describe, like we saw about before, that will tell you about all the functions and variables in Emacs, packages, everything else you could possibly want to know about something that's defined in Emacs. There's all these describe functions that will help you with that. If you go to the help menu, all these functions are here. So all the describe functions you might want to know about are listed here. There's also the read the Emacs manual item. So if you click that, it gives you the entire Emacs manual here. You can click all the different links for the different topics. There's also a frequently asked questions, and there's a tutorial you might want to check out that can help you learn how to edit things in Emacs, or like the basic key bindings. So there's a lot of great stuff in this menu that you should check out to learn more about Emacs. Built in, you don't have to go to the internet to find this stuff. It's just right here with you, anywhere you go without internet. Okay, so the last topic for today is how do you configure Emacs? Well, we're not going to go very in-depth here because I go really in-depth in other videos about this, but I'm going to tell you the main 2 ways that you would configure Emacs so that you know about them. First of all, there is the customization UI, and this is a full user interface for customizing any option in Emacs. And the interesting thing here is that it not only shows you the options that are built into Emacs, it shows you the options for any external package you install too. So any community package you install, all the options are going to show up here in the same user interface. So to get to that, use Alt-X and type in customize, press enter, and now you get this interface which basically tells you about all the different types of settings that are available in Emacs. You can click on those to jump into them and learn more about all the settings. They all have descriptions. So like the CUA Mode settings are here in this CUA Mode group. But you can also search for a setting. So say for instance, you want to know how to set your tab width for indentation. You can type in tab width and press enter here in this box. And then you can see there's a tab width setting. And here you can edit this value and set it to 2 or something, and then click apply for it to be applied for the current session. I believe there's a way to save it for all sessions here as well, but I don't see it at the moment. We're gonna go more in detail about how to use this UI in the future. Now, personally, I don't use this UI because I prefer to use the other option for Emacs, which is the init.el file. This file could have other names, but most commonly people know it as the init.el file. And basically what this is actual Emacs Lisp code that is used to configure your editor. So that means you're setting all the configuration variables using code, and you're loading packages using code, and you could define your own functions that connect to these packages using code in this file. In my opinion, this is the best way to configure Emacs because you can then check in your configuration to source control and share it between machines, or at least have it saved somewhere so that you don't lose it. So I have an entire video series called Emacs from Scratch that will tell you how to do this. If you want to learn more about how to configure Emacs and get a modern looking setup like I have on the screen right now, using community packages and the stuff that's built into Emacs by editing your init.el file. And just to show you an example of that, we actually did open an init.el file before, so let's just see if we can go back to that. Oh, I think I renamed it to test.el, but it's still the same file. Basically, it's just a file containing a bunch of code that is doing the configuration for Emacs. Now, I know that people say, oh, it's Lisp, it's kind of weird, it has all these parentheses. Well, when you start getting used to writing Emacs Lisp for the purpose of configuration, you realize it's not that complicated. So don't let that be something that stops you from trying to learn how to do this, because you're gonna get a lot of joy from learning how to configure Emacs properly and setting it up exactly the way that you like it. So you're gonna have a file that's gonna have a lot of lines of configuration, and it's all gonna be yours. So that's one of the best things about Emacs, in my opinion. Okay, so what's next? Well, I think this video should give you very much of what you need to know to get started using Emacs and to be productive with it on a daily basis. However, we weren't able to cover many things in depth because we were just trying to scratch the surface and get you started. So I'm gonna start making more videos in a new series called Emacs Essentials, which will cover many of these topics at a deeper level, so you can go from being a beginner to Emacs to an advanced user by the end of all the videos that we cover these topics. And I've already, like I mentioned, been making a ton of other videos about Emacs on this channel, so you should definitely check out the other playlist if you want to learn a lot more while I'm building out the Emacs Essentials series. So as I mentioned before, excuse me, the Emacs from Scratch series is all about configuring Emacs from the ground up using the init.el file. There's also the Emacs Tips series, which are like independent videos about various packages you might want to try out, things you might want to do. There's Emacs Desktop Environment, which is a very fun series where we turn Emacs into a complete desktop environment so you can do your window management and basically live in Emacs full time, which is basically what I do now. If you're used to using IDEs, integrated development environments for various programming languages, check out the Emacs IDE series. There's not many videos there at the moment, but the idea is that I'm going to continue making more videos showing specific configurations for different languages so that you can use Emacs as an IDE for those languages. There's a lot of great packages that make this possible, so you should definitely check that out. There's also the Emacs mail package where I talk about how to basically do your email in Emacs. So that may sound kind of weird, but it's possible. So definitely check that out too. And then if you want to learn more about the language for configuring and extending Emacs called Emacs Lisp, I'm currently working on a series called Learning Emacs Lisp that will teach you about that language and how to use it. And lastly, if you want to know a little bit more about what Emacs is capable of, check out the video I did at the beginning of this year called 5 Reasons to Learn Emacs in 2021, where I give a little bit of a demo of some of the other cool things that you can do with Emacs. It might be interesting for you to see that. So definitely check out the show notes for this episode. I know we covered a lot of things, but I'm going to have all the stuff here in the show excuse me, in the show notes for you to check out. And definitely subscribe to the channel and click the bell to be notified whenever we post new videos and when I go live every Friday. So we do a live stream every Friday where the community of system crafters gets together and talks about Emacs and basically other interesting topics that have come up that week. So it's a very fun environment, so you should definitely come check that out. Also, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice from the long video here. Check out the link to the Discord below. If you want to get some help getting started with Emacs, join the Discord. We're all there hanging out. There's about 700 people there now. And we're all, enthusiasts of Emacs. We all love using Emacs. So definitely come check that out and join us there. It's a lot of fun. Okay, before my voice goes completely, let me just say thank you to my sponsors. So these amazing people have decided to sponsor the work that I'm doing, making these videos about Emacs, GNU Geeks, and everything else that we talk about on this channel. I'm very thankful to them for doing this because it gives me a lot of motivation to keep going, and it just makes me feel like people actually appreciate what I'm doing. So I'm very thankful to all of them. So if you are interested in becoming a sponsor of this channel, definitely check out the 2 links that I have below, one for GitHub sponsors and one for Patreon. You can do whichever one you choose. Also, I have a link to PayPal if you want to do one-time donations. Anything you choose to do is fine. Otherwise, this content is free, and definitely come and check it out, be a part of the community, and it costs you nothing. So anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope this video was helpful for you to get started with Emacs. Definitely let me know in the comments if you have any further questions of things that I could cover in future videos. And until next time, thanks a lot for watching. Happy hacking.